Good morning, everyone. Very happy to welcome all of you this morning, especially those who are participating in the Quo Vadis days. I hope it's been a good time for you. A time to kind of get away and be quiet and listen and reflect on and ask the Lord to help you in your thinking about or discerning to study for the priesthood. I began thinking about studying for the priesthood at a much younger age than you. I was in the 6th grade whenever I started thinking about it, and entered the seminary when I was in the 9th grade at what is now the Chancery office. So I entered there when I was 14 years old, and I'm back in the same place I started when I was 14 years old. So I didn't go very far in life. But it's 40 years now that I am a priest, and it is a wonderful experience. I thank God every day for the vocation that He's given to me, and we have to pray and ask the Lord to call us and to let us know if He wants us to be His servant, if He wants us to work for the unity of the church and to build up the body of Christ here on earth. Our world needs you very much. So I hope you think in terms of what service you can give to making our world a beautiful place and also a place where the kingdom of God can grow. I want to welcome also the parents who are here and to thank you for your support and also for your encouragement of those who are making these days here today, as well as the seminarians and priests who are helping during these Quo Vadis days.
All right, so our next speaker needs no introduction because it's me. And you know me. Thank you. So this is, we do this same talk every year. It's called What Now, right? Hopefully you've had a good experience. Hopefully you've heard some things that helped you in your discernment. Hopefully you heard some things that maybe struck up something in you. Oh, I need to write that down and pray with it some more, right? There were certainly some things that struck me. I wrote them down, then I smushed a wasp with them. So I'll take these to prayer and I'll go through them myself. But just sort of a couple of things to help you maybe as you leave here and go back to your regular daily life. The first thing that I want to talk about that I'm noticing more and more, which is I think both good and bad, is that there is no secret formula, magic formula to success in vocations. Right? There's no list of things. Okay, if I do this, this, and this, we're going to have all kinds of men join the priesthood and religious life, all kind of women become sisters and nuns, and everything's going to be great. Right? And there's no magic formula for you as an individual discerning either, right? But there are some very easy, I think, and practical steps that you can take, and that's kind of what I want to go through in this little conference. So what is it that you can do to continue to discern that call to the priesthood or religious life that you think God has perhaps placed on your heart, and continue to foster that call if you're still young and wanting to see where it takes you. And the first thing that you have to do, that we all have to do, is to live our primary vocation, right? We all have two vocations, and we all have one vocation that's the same. Mine's the same as yours, as yours, as yours, as yours. No matter if you become a priest or religious or whatever, get married, doesn't matter. What's that primary vocation that we all have? Holiness, right? Second Vatican Council puts it as the universal call to holiness. And so we all have to be living that call in order to know the other call that God is giving us. Right? We call it primary because it comes first. We have to live that call to holiness first before we can discern well if God is calling us to be a priest or a religious, right? If I'm not close to God, then how am I going to hear what He's asking me to do with my life, right? So we have to be close to God first. And again, you're going to think I'm a fraud because of the things I'm telling you, because they're so easy and I think obvious, but they're important, and so I'm going to go over them again. And kind of a little note, this is what Mr. Raymond was saying last night, right? He said that vocation never left him when he left seminary. That vocation to holiness. And so he saw those things like the breviary and the other spiritual practices that he picked up at the seminary. He saw those as essential to his life of holiness, and so he keeps them up so he can continue to live that life of holiness in his marriage. So what can you do to continue to develop that life of holiness? What's maybe one very obvious thing that you can do to continue to grow in that life of holiness? Pray. Pray, right? How can we know what God is calling us to do if we don't know God? And we learn about God and we learn who God is in prayer. And so we need that. And I'll talk a little bit more about prayer in a little bit. What's another one you think?
Sacraments.
The sacraments. Which two in particular would be really helpful for us to grow in?
Eucharist and confession.
Eucharist and confession, right? We have to be close to God in the way that He has given Himself to us, right? And He's given Himself to us in the church and in those sacraments, particularly those sacraments of the Eucharist and of confession, right? We have to make ourselves, we have to make those available to ourselves often so that we can grow in holiness, so that we can know what it is that God is calling us to do, and to have the strength to be able to do it when we figure it out, right? It's one thing to know what God is calling us to do. It's another thing to be able to do it, right? It's scary at times, but we have the strength to do it if we stay close to Him in the sacraments. Another thing following on Father Fontana's talk is that we need to, as men, strive for purity, right? Purity of heart. And a big part of that, or a part of that, as he said, is chastity, right? And so we have to be striving to live as chaste men, right? How do we go about doing that? Well, why do we need to do that, first of all? Because as he was saying yesterday, right, a pure man is a man who has an open heart, right? A man who's able to love well and who's able to love in many ways. And I was thinking about this morning. One of my favorite, I don't remember quotes like Father Fontana or some of these other smarter people do. So when I remember something, I feel like it's very important. And so I remember reading on the beach in seminary with a bunch of other seminarians. We were on the beach, and I was reading this book. And I read from this guy named von Balthasar, this book called Mary, the Church at the Source. And he says that the idea that we say that Mary was immaculately conceived has to be so because of what we say about Jesus and what we say about her. And so he says that if she would have had any stain of sin on her, she wouldn't have had been able to say yes so boundlessly, right? So openly, so unrestrictedly to what God was asking of her. And I think that's a good thing for us to remember, right? The more pure we are, and chastity is a part of that, the more easily and the more we are going to be able to say yes to God in what He asks of us, right? And so we have to strive for that, that purity that we need to say that. And so a growing problem, right, is chastity is a growing problem today. Pornography is a growing problem. And so to be bold in combating it if it is something that you struggle with, right? Certainly through the sacrament of confession. That is the number one place where you should take that, right? And if you take it there, the priest may suggest to you a few things that can be helpful. And I'm going to give you some things that I suggest from time to time for people who struggle with it. Confession is great. It's needed. It's necessary. But it also might be helpful to talk to a priest in spiritual direction, right? If it is, again, something that you struggle with, there he can kind of spend more time with you trying to work on a plan of life to overcome it. Right? The sacrament of confession, a lot of times if you go often, you know there are lines, and so we care for you and we give you what you need, but sometimes we have to be sort of quick. And so speaking to your priest can maybe help you to get more help with that. One thing I always think about, especially in this regard, is that sometimes we need to take drastic measures. Right? In that scripture passage that Father Fontana talked about yesterday, about the purity of heart, right? In the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus also talks about how if we sin with our eye, what do we need to do?
Pluck it out.
Pluck it out. And if we sin with our hand, what do we need to do?
Cut it off.
Cut it off. Does God really want us to pluck our eye out and cut our hand off? No. What is he trying to do? What is Jesus trying to do?
If something causes you to sin, then just get rid of it. Like, if I want my phone too much, then I think you should put it away for a time.
You want to give the rest of the conference? Because that's exactly it. It's exactly it, right? He is being very forceful to get our attention, to say that we need to be serious and sometimes take what might seem like drastic measures to try to root those causes of sin out of our lives. So the phone is a perfect example, right? If the phone causes you to sin or is a temptation for you to sin, get rid of it, right? Might seem crazy, might seem drastic, but better to get rid of the phone than to go to hell with the phone, right? Right? Okay? So sometimes we need to take drastic measures. Put a block on it, right? Covenant Eyes is a great tool that can be used to block things that you shouldn't be going to. And it has the function of finding someone that you trust, right? Not just any random person, but someone you trust that can hold you accountable, and it'll send them an email if you go somewhere you shouldn't go, and then they can approach you and say, hey man, like, looks like you've been struggling. What's going on? Right? Have that accountability to be able to try to overcome these things. Another thing that's incredibly important in our lives in general, but that can be particularly helpful in this area of chastity, are doing penance and particularly fasting. Right? There's something about denying ourselves that bodily pleasure of food that helps in growing in temperance. And it can help us to overcome other bodily temptations. Right? So implement some sort of fasting in your life. I know that you are growing young men, that you have very healthy appetites, but to implement that into your life, maybe a meal a day, a meal a week, or a certain type of food for a day, right? I love sweets. So maybe one day a week, if you like sweets, you can say, I'm not going to have sweets today, as I chew on a peppermint, right? But to implement those things in your life, cold showers is it's terrible, but it's great. Again, to deny ourselves, to do that penance so that we can sort of gain control over our bodies. And the great thing about the virtues is that if we develop them in one area of our life, they carry over into other areas. So if I'm able to say no to food or to a warm shower or to my bed for a night or to my pillow, then it's going to help me to be able to say no to those sexual temptations, okay? And so to continue to work on that. Another thing that could be helpful for you that I mentioned in passing is spiritual direction, right? Speaking to a priest on a regular basis to help you go through those things that are coming up in discernment, right? Well, Father, I was in prayer and like this happened. And so to have that objective outside perspective, because when we're tied up in it, I know when I was discerning going to the seminary, when we're tied up in it, we can make ourselves think a whole lot of things and anything, right? If I want to run away, then I can maybe convince myself, well, God really wants me to be married, right? Or if I'm feeling pressure maybe from someone else, then I can say, well, yeah, God's calling me to be a priest, and maybe he's not. So to have that objective outside voice to kind of work through those things and to help you in your general growth in holiness can be very helpful. So, maybe start with your parish priest, talk to him, see if that's something that he'd be willing to do. I'm not going to say to trick him, but generally, priests would be more open to it because we're busy and we convince ourselves that we don't have time to do things. If you say, Father, I'm thinking about the priesthood and I'd really like some help, that might kind of open him up to say yes, when maybe he might be tempted to say, well, I don't really have time, okay? One thing that I probably would not be standing here today if I didn't have is a support group. Right, a support group of men who are like yourself to grow in holiness. And I started this, thank God, when I was in high school. Once a week, me and a group of friends would get together with some of the leaders at our parish, and we would just say how the week was going. Things we were struggling with, things that went well. And this amazes me. I've been thinking about this the last few months. You know what I would always say in these meetings every single week? I forgot to pray this week. And it was over and over and over again that I had to come before my friends and say, I forgot to pray. And we would come up with all these schemes. All right, when the bell rings at school, that's going to be our reminder to pray. And I would still forget. And so that's comforting to me when I think about my life now and how much I pray. I still have room to grow. But to think about the fact that I just would forget to pray. And God has worked in me and helped me to grow in that way. But those men that I gathered with were very helpful. And even to today, I have 4 other priests that I meet with every week. Again, we talk about how things are going. We talk about the readings for the coming week and homily ideas. But to hold each other accountable is very important. And it's good to see other men who are struggling like you're struggling and who are striving, or at least trying to grow in holiness the same way that you are. So look for those men in your community that you can maybe start that with. And if you noticed, right, the panel last night, what did most of the people who answered say? Like, what did they have in common in their experiences, their best experience in seminary? Were they by themselves? Their best experiences were things that they did with other people, or just the fact that they were with other people, right? That they were in a community of like-minded individuals who were trying to grow in holiness and all doing it together and being men together, right? So it's really important to have that contact with those other men who are striving for those things. So maybe more directly, a next step that you could take is to contact me, right? I'm the vocation director. I'm the first person you would talk to start that process of maybe applying to the seminary. And I mean, look at how much we thought of. On the back of your book that we gave you is contact information. It's almost like we want to help you out, right? So if you are discerning and you have questions or you want to talk, set up a meeting, contact the office and we can set up a meeting, okay? And just sort of, because I did have some people ask, like, how do I start the application process and all of that? The first thing is to contact me. But the one kind of general thing is, really you can't start the application process until senior year of high school, right? So if you're a freshman or a sophomore, even going into your junior year, let's keep in touch, right? If you have questions, we can meet and all of that. But we can't start the formal application process until later on because you have to finish high school first, right? Just sort of a practical thing. It's not that I don't want to deal with you, all right? It's that just practicalities. But I'm always open to talking to you if you have questions or need help. And so one thing that was said, this is what I'll close with, one thing that was said by several of our presenters about St. Joseph, right, was that St. Joseph was a man of what? Prayer. A prayer? Purity. So the 5 P's, all right, but he was a man of prayer, but where did that, what did prayer lead to?
Silence.
Well, silence was kind of helped foster that prayer, yes? Obedience, but obedience in actions, right? That St. Joseph was a man of silence, and that silence allowed him to be a man of prayer. And because of that prayer, we don't really hear his words, but we see things that he did, right? That he was a man of action, and that those actions were good because they sprang forth from his prayer. And so we too are only going to be able to respond to God's call, whatever that is, right? If we are men of prayer. If we are men who take time to discern that call, and who in that prayer are strengthened to be able to act in the way that he calls us to act, right? And so I encourage you to continue to be men of prayer. Hopefully these days helped you to grow in your prayer life, whether it was by introducing you to new types of prayer that you maybe haven't explored before, right? But to be faithful to those things. If you enjoyed praying daytime prayer and morning prayer, then to maybe, again, talk to your priest, because the breviary can be a little difficult to learn on your own, and to pray the liturgy of the hours, right? Maybe not all of it, but to learn that and to use that in your daily prayer. Obviously, continue going to Mass on Sundays and holy days, but even during the week if you can, to enter into that most powerful prayer of the church and to receive the Eucharist as often as you can worthily, to be able to receive that grace to continue to grow in holiness. And then if you don't have the habit, and if you were inspired by those times of adoration, right, those times of silent prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, to do that at your home parish. Right? If you have a chapel, great. If not, go to the church. And spend that time, even if Jesus isn't exposed, to spend that time in the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, and to sit in silence, even if it's uncomfortable, and to continue to ask God what it is that he wants from you and what it is he's asking you to do in your life. And so those are my sort of closing remarks. But if you have any questions about anything that I didn't touch on, I'm happy to try to answer those now. Man, I'm good. All right. Yes, sir.
Do you think it's a good idea for some people to enter college first before entering the seminary?
That's a great question. I do. And it's a case-by-case basis. It just kind of depends on a few things. It depends on where a guy is in his discernment. So let's say I'm a senior, and it's March of my senior year of high school. And all of a sudden I start feeling maybe God's calling me to be a seminarian, or maybe God's calling me to be a priest. Maybe that's a little late, and like I hadn't really thought about it before, I hadn't thought through it a lot, and so maybe I would go to college and check it out and continue to pray, continue to live that life of the sacraments and of prayer, and continue to talk to my priest and the vocation director, and then maybe I could go later, right? Now, if someone, let's say you're a sophomore and you're here and you feel that call and it's been there for a while, and you get to your senior year and it's still there and you're still thinking that God's calling you to do it, obviously all of this is always in connection with the vocation director, right? Because just because I want to sign up doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to go, right? The diocese and the vocation director has a say in it. But that would be more of a sort of a clear sign to go right out of high school. Some priests think people need experience. If God's calling you and everything lines up, then I don't think it's a problem for some people to go out of high school. It's different for every person. Yep.
How many years does it take you to study in the seminary to become a priest? Do you have to go to 2 colleges?
Good question. So how long does it take you to become a priest? It depends. There are no black and white answers. It depends. Generally speaking, the least amount of time you would spend in seminary is 6 years, which is what I did. So I finished college first, and then I went to seminary. So I did 2 years of philosophy, and then I did 4 years of theology. If someone would go straight out of high school, it would be 4 years of philosophy, a regular college degree, and then 4 more years of theology. There are a few strange guys, smart guys, who do 1 extra year. So it could take anywhere from as little as 6 years to as much as 9. Any other questions?
How long does it take for, like Brother John, how long does it take for you, is he a good brother?
Yeah, so that, again, it depends. So what I described was for a diocesan priest. For religious, it's different because they do formation differently. So generally, if you're going to become a religious priest, like Brother John Joseph, you would enter the community first, which he said yesterday. You would enter the religious community or order first. You would do your formation for the order and become a member of the order, and then they would send you off. So you may do, say, 2 years, kind of learning about the order, making sure that you want to do that particular thing, and then you would do the 6, 8, sometimes 10 years of further studies for the priesthood. And it depends on the order. The orders are different from order to order. Mm-hmm.
Would you, after you made your formation within that center, that community, you would go to the same, you'd go to St. Ben's, or would they send you a different college?
It depends.
Okay.
So Brother John Joseph did go to St. Ben's, and now he's at Notre Dame with the other seminarians from Lafayette. But a lot of the orders have their own houses of formation and colleges and things like that. For instance, the Jesuits. The Jesuits have schools all over the place. They have houses of formation, so they would either do it internally, or they would a lot of times do it at one of their Jesuit-run universities. So again, it just kind of depends on the order. Yes, sir.
So what if you go to the seminary just to try out, but then you leave around like your fourth year philosophy, knowing that, maybe I'm not made to go to the priesthood?
Yeah. So remember what I talked about last night in the panel, and why we get people like Mr. Raymond to come to the panel to show that seminary is a step of discernment, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be a priest. It does mean that you're thinking very seriously about it, and that you and the diocese thinks that there is a good possibility that you might become a priest, but that it is a step of discernment, and so it doesn't end whenever you enter, right? And so if people leave after good discernment, then that's not a problem. And there are a lot of different helps in that discernment, which is very comforting to me, especially the farther along I got and the closer I got to ordination. Right? It wasn't just my decision. Yes, I was praying and I was asking God, and I still felt like He was calling me. But every year in the seminary, you have an evaluation with the formation staff and usually the vocation director or the director of seminarians. And so they have to approve you to continue on. The bishop has to approve you to continue on, usually with the recommendation of the vocation directors or director of seminarians. So you have a spiritual director who you meet with either every 2 weeks or every month, who's hearing all of the things that are going on in prayer and helping you to continue on that. You have a formation advisor. So you have all of these people who know you, who see you, who interact with you, and who are helping you in that discernment. And they all have to agree for the process to continue on. Yes, sir.
So what if you go to the seminary, but then you decide that you feel like God's calling you to be married, and then you leave the seminary, but then you want to go back to the seminary? Do you pick up where you left off, or?
Again, kind of case by case. Generally speaking, yes, but case by case assessment of that. No, there's no like kind of blanket policy, I guess. One thing that could be helpful in discernment too. There's sort of different views on this. I think that this is the correct one. That on a natural level, everybody is called to marriage, right? And so even I am called to marriage on a natural level, right? But that the priesthood or the religious life is a supernatural calling, right? So God calls us to do something above what is natural, beyond what is natural. And so we forsake the good of marriage, right? Marriage is a good thing. We need it. It's beautiful. But some of us are called to forsake that natural good for the sake of a supernatural calling, right? And I think this is particularly helpful because, like you said, a lot of men will say, well, I think maybe God's called me to be a priest, but I feel called to marriage. And I say, great. That is a good and healthy thing, right? But the question to ask is not, God, are you calling me to be married? Because that's a natural thing. But God, are you calling me to forsake that for something else? Right? And I think that can be very helpful in the discernment process.